Hey guys, welcome to the Big Liberty Show. Welcome. I have a very special guest with me today, and the topic we're discussing are essentially the new polling numbers. These are the polling numbers that the Institute of Race Relations have been producing, essentially for the month of April. And with the elections being closer, one can argue essentially that that these numbers will give a relatively good snapshot. Let me welcome my guest, Gareth van Onselen, who is the head of politics here at the Institute of Race Relations. Gareth, thank you so much for joining me. This is such an important topic insofar as it's giving us an insight as to what South Africans are thinking right now. The polling. Gareth, talk to us.
Okay, so today the Institute released its latest poll. Now, there are a couple of things that you need to say about any poll before you get into the numbers, which I know everyone is dying to know what the numbers are, but you have to put a whole lot of disclaimers up front. So a few things. First of all, just explain what the IRR is doing. We've just conducted this poll, and I'll get into the numbers now. It was in the field for sort of the last week of April, from the 18th to the 25th. It was around 2,300 respondents, just registered voters. But it's not our final poll. Yeah. We're going to release another one on the 6th of May, which will hopefully allow us to track the final week of the election campaign, and that's a very important week. Because during that week, historically, bigger parties tend to squeeze smaller parties, so their vote share increases and the vote share of smaller parties declines. So you need to bear that in mind when looking at these numbers. These are before the last 2 weeks of the election campaign. It came out of the field with 14 days to go, and we still need to see the effect of that, what's called a squeeze, on those smaller parties. So that being said, there are a whole lot of fascinating numbers in this poll, which I can get into if you want.
Absolutely.
Let's just start with the biggest one, which is obviously the national voting intention question. Yeah. So we've got, as a baseline number, the ANC on 49.5%, which is a big decline from our last poll in February when it was on 54.7%.
That's right.
We've got the DA more or less stable at 21.3%, which is pretty much where it was in February. It was 21.8% back then. And we've got the EFF on 14.9%, which is a significant amount of growth for that party, up from 12.2%.
Yeah.
And it would seem that the EFF's growth is coming at the ANC's expense. It's a trend that we've now seen in two polls. In February, the ANC declined slightly at the EFF's expense, and it's happened again in April. And that will be a trend that the ANC wants to arrest in the last 2 weeks and turn around, because that's starting to put its majority in the balance and is a real threat to the party.
On this particular point, it would seem that the EFF have really been the biggest winners in this particular election, or seems to be standing to be, rather, the biggest winners in this election. Is there a tail in this in terms of the DA's poor performance then, if one wants to look at it that way? They speak a lot about these having been the 9 wasted years, but have they capitalized on them if you look at the numbers?
Well, first of all, I have to agree with you. I think whatever the election result in percentage terms, in other words, off its base of around 6.3% in 2014, the EFF is going to outgrow any of the other big three parties significantly. And there's a chance it could double its support, which is no mean feat for a very small party. It's done that at the expense of the ANC. In other words, whatever growth it gets seems to be alienated ANC voters that are turning first to the EFF. So your question is an important one. To what degree and why are those people turning first to the EFF as opposed to the DA? I'm not sure I know the answer to that definitively. There are probably a multiple number of reasons for it. But one of it is that they see the EFF as a more authentic home for whatever it is they're feeling,
right?
Before they do the ANC, before they do the DA. And so that seems to be their first party of choice, as probably a protest vote on some degree, probably some small inclination towards the EFF's kind of radicalism and left-leaning policies, but also because they're just angry with the ANC, I think, and want to stick it to that party, and Malema and the EFF best exemplify that.
Gareth, just before we continue, in terms of the poll itself, it goes into great length, and rightly so, around the different scenarios in terms of turnout, voter turnout, for instance. From your work, what are we likely looking at being the expected turnout in this election, and what were the sort of 4 turnout scenarios that you guys used?
Yes, so that's also a very important question because, I mean, one of the problems with polls is they assume 100% turnout.
Yeah.
The review of every single respondent is recorded, but obviously on election day, not every single person votes. So you need to develop some kind of model to be able to demonstrate what happens when those people who aren't likely to vote are taken out of the sample.
Yeah.
We do that in our polls by asking a range of questions, about 4 questions that are designed to gauge a respondent's likelihood to vote. Then for each question, you attach a probability of voting to that voter and you take out of the pool those are least likely to vote. And those things are very important because, as I say, that's what happens on election day. They're not predictive, though.
Yes.
It's impossible to predict what turnout will be. The best guide is history. In 2014, turnout was around 73%. And that's a decline from the election before that in 2009. It's most likely going to decline again for a number of reasons. One of them being that a significantly smaller number of voters have been registered in this.
In fact, the IEC only had one registration weekend, for example.
Yes, it's only had one weekend, and it's also been constrained by this court order that it has to comply with. So turnout is likely going to be lower, probably somewhere around the 70, 69 range, but we don't know exactly.
Yeah.
So that being said, it's important to look at our turnout scenarios and see what they say. The one, we generated 4, but one of them is around 69%. Let's use that one because too many numbers get confusing. If you do that, the ANC's vote jumps to 51%. Well, it's hardly a jump, but it does improve to
Trust me, they'll
51%. The DA grows more significantly to 24%, and the EFF stays more or less stable at around 14%. Now, that's what's interesting about that was when you had lower turnouts way back in our December poll, the ANC went from 56, which it was on then, all the way up to 60. But it seems to, in April, have lost that differential turnout. And it is now operating at the very margins of its support base. In other words, it's got a problem with people who are not likely to vote their ANC, and when they drop out the pool, it hurts that party. The DA does seem to be able to get some small differential advantage, and that will, as things stand, look set to push it up into the sort of mid-20 range. And the EFF's base is fairly solid. It seems to hold up against a lower turnout. But remember, these are a snapshot in time. This isn't a prediction, and that was how things were in April.
Maybe as we whittle it down, I suppose, we've looked at the different turnout rates and et cetera, or rather, let me move us towards some of the provincial stuff that you began to look at. Gauteng and the Western Cape are the two that really you focused on in this particular study. Let's talk about Gauteng, I suppose, the one which everybody will be talking about. What are we looking at Gauteng here? Assuming the just near 70% turnout.
So Gauteng was very interesting in this poll. Just to set the scene, we've now asked a provincial ballot question for Gauteng in 2 polls, for February and this latest one in April. And obviously it's important to distinguish when you're asking questions in a poll between the provincial and national ballot, because people sometimes split their vote and you need a specific question to test provincial sentiment.
That's right.
So in February, we had the ANC way below a majority, and its baseline support before any turnout was 41%, which is obviously a huge decline from the 53 it got in 2014. It's slightly improved in April, up to 42 and a bit, and that might suggest that it sort of bottomed out at around 41 and is starting to slowly turn the tide. Its problem is time. It's only got 2 weeks left, and that's a huge differential to make up. The DA doesn't seem to have moved much. Its baseline support stays at around 31 in Gauteng, but it does enjoy, unlike the ANC, quite a big jump on differential turnout. And interestingly, on our lowest turnout for Gauteng, which is around 69%, I think, or 67, it actually overtakes the ANC. 40% for the DA, 39% for the ANC. So just as nationally, the ANC's got a turnout problem. Turnout drops, it hurts it also in Gauteng, and it greatly benefits the DA. So that's an interesting thing. The one other interesting aspect about Gauteng is that the EFF's vote has declined significantly in Gauteng. Now, Gauteng historically has been the backbone of the EFF support. In 2014, 40% of all EFF votes came from Gauteng. And it was on 18.2% in February. It's dropped by about 5 points all the way down to 13%.
That's a big drop.
And that's a conundrum given that it's increased nationally.
Yeah.
So what are the factors at play here? Well, the one is the EFF must be growing elsewhere. You'll see when we talk about the Western Cape just now, we've got it on about 7% there, which has come from almost nowhere. And it's on, as per our December poll, around 10% in KZN. So those two big growth areas are supplementing its decline in Gauteng. But the key lesson to take away from this is how fragile the EFF's vote is, sort of above 10%. And those people can easily shift back to the ANC, as has happened in Gauteng. And the ANC will take some solace from that nationally, because if it can replicate what it looks like it's just beginning to start doing in Gauteng nationally, it can push up towards that 55% mark.
This is interesting. And I think it provides a lot of insight for the political parties and how essentially they campaign over the next 2 weeks. Just one more question, I suppose, on the ANC in Gauteng. It's a bit of a conundrum for them right now, isn't it? Insofar as their game, by the sounds of it now, is to essentially try and get out their vote on election day. Do you see and I'm being hypothetical here, Gareth, do you see them, or rather, is this essentially in the last 2 weeks of this election, should this be their sole focus? In other words, bringing out their voting base in order to shore up some form of majority, even if it isn't an outright one, to win the election outright? Is that the game they should be playing right now?
Well, look, the ANC's situation in Gauteng is complex. If you look at the ANC's share of the voter pool going back 3 or 4 elections, it's stayed pretty much stable at around 2.5 million votes. And that's a problem because over time the electoral pool grows, and so even if you're holding the same number of votes, it becomes proportionally less, which is one of the reasons why the ANC has systematically declined in Gauteng over the years. So its problem historically is that it's not growing its share of the vote pool. And it can die in the ditch in this election, and actually it absolutely must, to get its existing base out, to get those potential 2.5 million people to the polls, but the pool has grown again. And it was on a knife edge with 53% in 2014. So even if it does that, it's going to be very close, and it's unlikely that it'll get all 2.5 to the polls. So it needs to get its base out, and it needs some growth to supplement the growth of the electoral pool.
A conundrum they find themselves in. Gareth, let's move to the Western Cape. Again, these are 2 provinces that are perhaps the powerhouses of our economy, of course, but also very contentious in the Western Cape too. One wouldn't have thought maybe a few months ago, or maybe they did, that the DA would be facing the prospect of a massive decline in support in the province. What are the numbers saying?
Well, I think a few months ago people would have been expecting that prospect. The DA has been a real mess in the Western Cape for a good 3 years now, for a wide variety of complex reasons. So we've got the DA on, before any turnout scenario, on around 44% in the Western Cape. And obviously in 2014 it was on 59, so that's a big decline. But things are not looking any better. Oh, sorry, and it's also a decline from February when we had it on 50. So it's dropped by about 6 points since February. But its problems are no better or worse than the ANC, which has declined 6 points since February. Remarkable given the state of the DA. And it's down way into the 20s now. Both of these parties seem to have lost support to smaller parties. The ACDP is looking very strong in the Western Cape at 7%. Which
is amazing. Because previously at 3.5%, the ACDP.
So in February, correct. Yeah. So they've doubled from February. And the EFF has come from nowhere. We had it on 1% in February, and it's up to 6.8 now, which is a huge amount of growth. And supplemented by other smaller parties, like the Good Movement is on around 2.8%. So you add those 3 together, and you've got 15%, and that's hurting the DA and the ANC. Yeah. The EFF hurting the ANC, the other 2 parties hurting the DA. The DA there is some relief for the DA though, because on lower turnout, it does get to 50% and 51%. Lower turnout doesn't help the ANC at all. It remains stuck at around 30. But interestingly, the smaller parties hold up well under lower turnout. They do lose 1% or 2%, but they remain really solid at sort of 6 or 5%. So the DA's got a fight on its hands as well. It does have a kind of lower turnout differential in its favor, but that majority is looking fragile and it needs to win back its base support there.
Let's zoom in on the ANC again here, because to me it's just absolutely amazing that you can have a DA literally have so much infighting and bad PR for such a long time, and I mean bruisingly bad PR, that they essentially can't, on the one hand, show any form of growth, and actually are registering decline. What is it? Is it a poor strategy by the the ANC leadership in the province? Is there an ANC leadership in that province?
Well, let me answer your question specifically and also with reference to Gauteng. So first of all, the ANC in the Western Cape has been an unmitigated disaster for as long as the DA has had its problems. It has had several leadership scandals. It doesn't seem to have any kind of real forceful coordinating leadership. The Dullah Omar region, which is basically the whole of the Cape Town metro, had to be disbanded. They've had to send in Ibrahim Rasool. It's just a mess, that province, and it shows in its polling numbers. But the thing that's interesting about the official opposition in both the Western Cape and Gauteng, and they're the opposites. In Gauteng, it's the DA. In the Western Cape, it's the ANC, is both have failed to capitalize on the total implosion of the majority party. Both those provinces are a real indictment of the official opposition. The ANC in the Western Cape and the DA in Gauteng, they don't seem to be able to eat into the crisis that is the majority party. And there's some questions to be asked about those two parties in those provinces.
The funny thing is, maybe if you bring it back to just a national picture for a second, the one party that seems to have actually done quite well in eating into the ANC support is seemingly the EFF. And if you bring it back to the Western Cape, one could maybe make the argument that the spin-off of that national trend is more pronounced, if that's the expression, in the Western Cape, in terms of now seeing that jump from previously polling at 1% and now polling at somewhere around nearly just 7%. Could it be said that the contestation of maybe the quote-unquote black vote, the township vote in the Western Cape, is where we're seeing the EFF begin to eat into the EFF eat into the NC's vote in the Western Cape?
Look, the brutal truth is that I don't know the exact answer to that question. You'd have to do some regressions into our data to get some very specific things. But I think you're on the right track anecdotally insofar as the majority of the EFF's votes in all of our polls and historically seems to come from sort of, urban, metro-dwelling, lower working class black South Africans. And in urban centres like Gauteng and KZN to a degree and the Western Cape, that is where its appeal is strongest. And so it kind of makes sense that it would start to grow in those areas, perhaps behind Gauteng, but they both seem to be picking up and supplementing the ANC's national vote, the EFF's national vote.
Last one on the Western Cape, the story of the ACDP. Come on, that is that is like the comeback kid story of essentially their pinnacle in this election. Do we have any insights as to what's happening here? I mean, I know their local or the provincial leader, the Furlon, I can't think of his surname, very charismatic, very much involved in the church network there. Is he maybe spinning the churches to sort of rally support behind the ACDP, or is there something larger at play here?
Well, look, again, we'll have to get away from what the hard data says and get a bit into speculation here. So I can't tell you exactly what it is that's driving the ACDP's vote, and I suspect it's a conundrum for the DA as well, which is struggling to break their stranglehold on this sort of 7% of the vote. The ACDP has historically had very good networks amongst the religious community in the Western Cape, and it's very good at utilizing them, so it can draw on those. But I think there is a kind of crisis of morality in South Africa. And when that happens in a province like the Western Cape, where the crisis affects not just the ANC, but also the DA, and the EFF is not really an option, those people that care about that kind of thing, the ACDP is really the only choice left on the table for them. And I think that is where they go. And that's probably why that support is relatively solid, because they've made quite a core fundamental decision about why that party is the best choice for them.
Gareth, the next interesting thing that I think I also see a lot on my social media, are people saying, on the one hand, people ask the random question, who should I vote for? And I say, I can't tell you that. And then you have that second group and you say, well, I know exactly who I'm going to vote for, but I'm going to split my vote between national and province. Do we have any data on this? What are we seeing?
Okay, so we did look at the two different ballots in Gauteng and the Western Cape, which are the only two places we can look at it, because those are the only two places we did provincial ballot testing for. And I don't think there's an enormous increase in the amount of ballot splitting. It seems more or less what it has been historically. But the ANC's vote in Gauteng is more heavily weighted towards the national ballot. And that is probably a consequence of voters going, we trust you more to be a national government than we do a provincial government. In the opposite direction, the DA's vote in Gauteng is weighted towards it as a provincial government, and it does worse on the national ballot, and that's probably a consequence of its reputation as a very good provincial government. In the Western Cape, it's a bit different. The DA, does enjoy the same advantage. People do think, it's more heavily weighted towards its provincial ballot. It does better on the provincial ballot, and that's obviously a consequence of its reputation in that province. But that differential has shrunk from February to April, and that's probably underpinning its decline as well, is a kind of crisis of faith among some of the DA's core support base as to whether it is the right choice for them.
Well, maybe, as we look to sort of wind this down, let's look at the voting intentions by race, because, a lot is said about the demographics of who supports which party. What are we seeing between the top three parties in terms of race and just race, actually, as a major?
Okay, so there's no big revelations on the race front. The indicators are pretty much what they have been for most of our polls, with some small differentials. The ANC's vote base remains largely dominated by black South Africans. Around 96% of its support comes from black South Africans. The EFF is even more homogenous in that sense. It's about 97% of its support comes from black South Africans. The DA has the most diverse support base, sort of around 27 black, 30% white, or just over 30%, and then a equal spread of coloureds and Indians. The DA has grown its support amongst black South Africans as a proportion of the whole population. Very small amount. We have it on 7.4% of all black voters as of April, and it was on around 6% in 2014. So that is the source of some encouragement. The party would have wanted much more growth than that, but it's been forced to focus on its base, and I think as a result, and of course it's competing with the EFF, it's only a small amount of support on that front.
In the final analysis then, and I'm going to coax through the 2 or 3 questions in this regard. Let's maybe look at, you opened up with a very important statement around, the final 2 weeks, the big parties put on what's called the squeeze, and the smaller parties lose out. This election has been marked by a few new inclusions, Good being one, I always make that error, the Capitalist Party of South Africa. Gareth, what are we seeing with these small parties on a national level? Are they appearing in the data at all?
Okay, so let me answer those 2 questions in reverse. First of all, no, a great many in fact, all of the new parties that have been formed and form the bulk of the ballot paper, we've got 48 parties on this telephone directory like ballot paper now, haven't made much of an impact at all. We've got 0.1% for the AIC and the ATM, but they're the only 2 that actually picked up. Good is on 0.2 nationally. We didn't even register any support for the Capitalist Party.
Which is surprising, given how loud they are on social media and how you would think, because of that projection, that they're heading towards, or they would reflect on hard data, for instance. That's very surprising.
Yes. So not a good showing for all these new parties. Just on your inference towards the squeeze, I just need to reiterate how important it is and how important it is to seeing these numbers in the right context. Yeah. Also, just gives me a little chance to plug our next poll, which is designed specifically to be able to illustrate how the squeeze works. So what we're going to do is run a tracking poll, essentially, for 7 days. And that will allow us, every day we're going to poll around 200 to 300 new people. we will drop 200, the oldest 200 people out of our April sample and supplement them with the new 100 and see what it does to the numbers. We'll do that on Saturday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all the way up to the Saturday before the election.
Right.
So you'll be able to see a moving average for these parties as you get closer to the election. And by the time we get to Saturday, we would have almost refreshed our whole sample that way. And it will be fascinating to see the effect of the squeeze. Will the ANC grow? To what extent it will grow? Will the DA manage to squeeze the ACDP and those parties that are causing its strife in the Western Cape? How will the EFF support hold up in the face of this ANC squeeze? We've seen in Gauteng it looks quite fragile. The ANC could easily get back up to 55 if it can apply the right kind of pressure. And of course, the biggest question of all is, will the ANC be able to close the gap between 42% and 50% in Gauteng? And it's going to be fascinating to see.
Gareth, thank you so much. I think the numbers always provide a lot of insights as to what people are thinking in that particular moment, but also heading forward. I mean, we're quite close to this election, and one has to almost wait and see what the final results will be, obviously. But we look forward to your polling, the tracking polling that we'll see in the run-up to the election. Guys, and thank you so much for watching. Of course, that was Gareth van Onselen, who is the head of politics and governance at the Institute of Race Relations. Guys, these numbers are super important insofar as giving you a snapshot as to what your fellow South Africans are thinking about the politics and the various campaigns and the elections. If you want more of this content, please go onto the IRR website. And you can also find Gareth online. Gareth, what is your social media again? It's at Chief van Onselen?
At Chief van Onselen. And also, obviously, this report that we're talking to will be up on the website.
Absolutely. And that is the Criterion report for April 2019. So you can find that at irr.org.za. And guys, remember to support the work of the Institute of Race Relations by signing up to become one of our monthly contributors. I mean, we average between 70 and 90 Rand a month of ordinary South Africans like you who say they love the work that we do and we provide and would like to see more of that content. You can SMS you can SMS us at 32823. You can SMS your name to 32823. SMS costs R1 and terms and conditions to apply. Or alternatively, find us online at irr.org.za/join. Guys, you've been watching The Big Liberty Show, and I'll keep you abreast on these sort of issues and more.